So welcome everybody to today's Thriving in the Decade of Disruption. I'm really glad to have a good friend of mine, Terry Woodcroft, joining us today. Terry and I work together helping commercialise research out of the University of Queensland, and Terry's got probably just a little bit more experience than I have in terms of this field. I'm only just saying that just to be mean, because she's a lovely good friend of mine. But what I'm really interested about talking with Terry about today is this journey, because Terry's in the middle of in the early stages really of a startup company that's really trying to disrupt and create a disruptive technology into a marketplace, and it's really exciting to see some Australian ideas and Australian companies really becoming global companies in a very small sense, I guess, but with big ambitions. So I guess one of the key things I want to bring out of today's conversation with Terry is this idea of when you've got an idea, and that might be just an idea, it might be a business model idea, it might be an invention. It might be a widget. The real challenge is trying to work out, well, is it a good idea? That's the hardest part, and that's why we know that 95% of startups fail and 80% of products fail, because people have these ideas and they're pretty crappy ideas, really. They might have made sense on paper, but as soon as you get them out into the real world, no one likes it. Someone says that your baby's ugly, and then you just realize, well, I've just invested all this time and money. So one of the questions I want to get down to with Terry is, well, when you've got this idea, this potential idea that sounds like it's going to unlock a lot of value, but how do you know? How do you get to that point before you actually then, mortgage the house and roll up the sleeves? How do you actually know that it's a good idea? So maybe, Terry, before we get started, maybe tell us a little bit about Ortra and what the idea is, and tell us about a little bit of that journey of where you've got to, where you started, where you got to, and where you're at now.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I came to this probably July, August 2017, and it was a serendipitous sort of thing where a fellow that I'd actually done engineering with years ago, that I'd sort of come across again, Richard Harris, we happened to go and meet up again and went and had coffee, and he said, I'm thinking about this thing with transformers. And I just went, yawn, like, really? Like, I cannot think of anything more boring if I'd tried, right? And so he's thinking, why transformers? Why are you interested in this thing? And he said, well, there was some research out of UQ. It was sort of fundamental research, but it was all about trying to bring something to an old industry. So for all of you, what Ortra does is we do monitoring of power transformers, so selling to utilities and smelters and big energy users. And transformers are weird things in that the technology hasn't actually changed since the 30s or 40s, 1930s or 40s. And so you actually have these assets in the field that are 40, 50, 60 years old. So if you think back and you think, okay, we're now monitoring these things that are critical infrastructure, all of these, and they're critical infrastructure, yet they were designed and put in 1960. So, think about the technology that was around in 1960. So what we now have is IoT and cloud processing and miniaturization of hardware and innovative solid state sensors. How can we actually use new technology to actually bring this old technology into the future? The other thing that was interesting about it is that a transformer from an engineering point of view is sort of cool because it is literally a black box. They're sealed environments. They generally don't get opened until it's major refurbishment. So being an engineer, I've always had a fondness for Schrodinger and his cat. And so you're actually going in there and saying, is the cat alive or dead? And how do I know if the cat's alive or dead? Or is the cat just sick? So, even though the transformer thing sounded really, boring, it was a case of there is a problem out there that people don't know how to solve this problem of, is the cat alive or dead, or is it going to last another 20 years? And this is from an infrastructure problem globally. It's $1 billion problem because you've got all these transformers that need to be replaced. And so, the whole gold-plated network thing, we should be replacing all these, but maybe we can make these old things go longer. Now, is there a thing there or not? And that was really the question. And so it was a case of, okay, maybe there's a thing there, maybe we can do something. How do we start on that journey?
Yeah. And look, just from what a couple of things you've said, I'm really interested in this idea, because I get, as you know, I've been running these on-prime workshops, and quite often, in fact, almost every second time, I get an engineering academic who's got an idea around electricity and transformers. And so there's always this assumption that there's this problem, that it's really old, and it's the same thing I get with engineers around sensors and infrastructure and how do we improve infrastructure management. And it seems like obviously there's a problem, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort going into solving that problem, that people are just dealing with it. And so I'm interested in the thinking around, well, okay, on paper, again, it looks like there's a problem, but how do you then find out, is there enough will, or is the problem severe enough or significant enough that people are prepared to take a risk on something new to try and solve the problem? I guess, and as you know, my journey with ProGel and Perky, we had this great solution, but no one really cared about the problem, about keeping probiotics alive.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in this very conservative industry. And we know in, say, electricity, resources, mining, it's so conservative that even though there are an infinite number of problems, they sort of just live with it. So how did you get to that point where you're able to say, well, here's this great idea, and how do you then find those customers who are aware enough of the problem and prepared to jump into it?
So a couple of things, you know, you do your book research. And so the delightful thing about this industry is the Australian Energy Regulator, for a start, makes them report all of this stuff. So there's all this publicly available data about how old transformers are, how often they're replaced, all of this sort of thing. So you could actually do and look at, you know, for me, for this particular market, it was really exciting because I could go and get the thing. I knew exactly how big the market was. I knew exactly how old all of those transformers were. And for a normal product management point of view, it's almost impossible for you to get that sort of information. So that was a bonus. However, to the question of, is it a problem? You go and you talk to people, and I think there's the thing of, first you've got to get inside the head of whoever your target might be. And I subscribe to this old German concept called Weltanschauung, which is, it's about someone's mindset or their worldview or how they look at things. And it's their outlook on life. And so regardless of what product you've got, and whether you might think, this is a massive problem, I can do all these fabulous things, if it's not an issue for them, it's irrelevant, you know, just forget it. So, and for me to go and put myself inside the head of a utilities engineer, and you think, okay, what do I care about? Why did I decide to do power engineering and do this thing first? I actually care about technology. Actually, I might be able to bait them with, this is new tech, and you get to do new tech, even though you're dealing with old tech things. I've got a big hierarchy there, so I need to make sure that I do what my bosses think is good and not try to step outside too much. Actually, a lot of this thing, I started this thing because I want a job and job security, so I don't want to do anything that's going to, you know, put myself out on a limb and being seen to be profligate or whatever. So you've got to sort of think, you know, how do I see the world and what are my problems day to day? And the big challenge with asset management and things like that is, sure, it's a problem, but it's a problem in 5 years. And I've got all these things I've got to do today. So, you know, it's really hard that they can go, that's interesting. I'm sort of interested in that. So we tend to go and you hook them with the technology, and then you've got to make it as seamless and as easy as possible. We'll put this in. It'll only take you half an hour. It won't cost anything. You know, so you have to make their initial adoption completely seamless. So spending a lot of time to say it's a no-brainer of like, why not? You want them to ask the question, not why, but why not? I'm not going to lose anything. There's not a lot of risk. So I'll give this a try. The benefit of some of these industries is they're super slow to make decisions and to take on new things, but they're also super sticky. So once we've had a trial in places, they never take them out. And so we've had nobody go backwards. And so if you're talking about a software as a service product, the effort to actually stop a contract and take something out is greater than actually just letting it keep going. So, but the question of are we doing enough is not a static thing, and it's never answered. Like, it is something we ask ourselves every day. So every bit of development that we do, who cares? Why is this going to make a difference or anything like that? So right from the beginning of bodging together our really super ugly minimum viable product, which was off the shelf sensors, a plastic box with, you know, a pie that we bought, you know, from overseas on there. And my co-founder writes the ugliest code. And even though I'm saying that globally now, he wrote the ugliest code and put it in there and some really ugly graphs on the front end, did a trial, and then you're actually getting customer feedback that whole time. So making friends with your customers and saying, you know, we're interested in your feedback and all that sort of stuff was really important to continue to do that. So we ask ourselves the question, is this a thing, not just at the beginning, but every day?
Yeah, that's really good. And I think there's a couple of things you've honed in on there. One of which is how do you make it as easy as possible to get validation? And how do you sort of reduce the barrier to entry? And I know, and Terry, you know, you were involved in some other technologies from UQ Engineering Technologies where it seemed to solve a really good problem, but the business model selected just didn't work. You know, it was just too expensive, too much money, too much exposure. And so really, I think one of the things that I've learned in this journey is you've got to get that MVP has got to be something that, as you said, is seamless, is really easy, but it's got to be able to offer this promise of a benefit, because ultimately they're still not going to do anything if there's nothing in it for them. And you think, I mean, if you can pull this off, it's amazing, because utilities is that thing where the ultimate end user just has to pay. You know, it's not as if I'm going to be cheaper. So ultimately, well, if it's 10% less productive, who cares? That doesn't cost me anything because they've got to buy it anyway. So it must have been hard how did you just maybe even unpack a little bit of the human elements, that getting inside the mind of your customer? What do you think was going on in their head personally that enabled you to get the hook in for them to say, yes, we'll do a trial? Was there something personally about them, or was it about the organization, or was it just about the excitement about the industry?
You know, so you want to show, you actually get them technically involved and say, oh, there's this thing and it's really interesting. And they go, you know, that's interesting. You know, as engineers, you sort of think, oh, there's this cool tech and, oh, that's interesting. And look, there's this curious thing over here. And you sort of rein in the curious thing. And then as they're starting to look at it and you say, oh, well, we could do this and maybe we could do that. And they say, oh, that's interesting. And so you actually take them on that journey. And so we're involved in so at the moment, the way that we market to people is not, here we have this new flashy thing, it's fabulous. It is here's all this information and technical background and things that help you do your job. And let us here's where the standards are and these sorts of things. So you become known as someone who can help them be educated about things. So we used to hold, and still do, hold free sessions for our early customers for professional development training, and just bring them up to speed. And here's the latest research on this thing and whatever. So they're happy to come into the room to go and talk about, oh, this is the latest thing, and you're not selling at all. You know, that would be the slide at the end or something, but you're just establishing yourselves as someone who knows about this area. So that was how you sink the hook. And then you've done that and they think, oh, well, these people have trained us. I guess we can give them a look in and, you know, go over and play on the side. And then you gradually come in. And then I think recently with one of our first clients, we got to the point where it was just the early adopters that were doing this thing, and they were the only users looking at the dashboard. But then they got to the point where they said, actually, this is important, and can you do a training session? We want to have everybody. We want to have all of the technicians and everybody all over the state looking at this thing. And so for having one or two people in there, you now have 46 users across the organization looking at it. So suddenly you're a lot more sticky. And because it's a B2B sale, the biggest issue is always whether your promoter or your sponsor or your person who's, you know, got the money goes and shifts jobs and then they disappear. And so you've lost all your leverage. The aim is to have all of those connections into that organization so it can move, but you've still got your hooks in.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think what's interesting about that is this idea that once you can get in, and so you find a way in, whichever way that is, whether it's emotional or functional or ego or you know, trying to protect my job or trying to make myself look better. But I think what you've articulated is this: getting them interested in, because they're engineers. Okay, so they're interested in the widgets, they're interested in how things work, and so they're intellectually engaged, and so they come on in. The barrier to entry is low, and then so you've sold them on a particular value proposition that was relevant for them, but then they've started to see where the value is, and they're almost coming in as salespeople for you, because they're then explaining it to other people in their organization and almost creating new value propositions. And that's what I think is actually really critical, is by actually engaging with your customer and letting them use it in an MVP format, there's new insights that pop out of that you could never have predicted. You could never have anticipated, or I had no idea that their sales team or marketing team or HR or OH&S team would have saw value in that. And that sounds exactly like what you've done.
Yeah, that's true. And because they're an industry that are very collegiate, because generally the distribution networks, they're geographically spaced, and that's the situation around the world. And we're lucky that it is somewhat of a homogenous market around the world. So what we did is we went and tested our thesis in each country, talked to various people there, and yeah, they had the same problems and all of that. So we were able to sort of say, yes, this is actually an international market. But our aim was, we actually used the Australian market as a purely test market. So we were happy to lose money and to do all of those things and to test things, to bring those customers with us. So they suggested various things and were involved. And we're big believers in your earlier customers. If you become friends with them, you go through problems, you're seen to be there and helping them when they have problems, and you come out the other side, they're really strong relationships. And then your marketing ends up being collegial, because those groups, those people are members of international associations. And so they talk to their colleagues, you know, around the world. So you start then to sell, not by saying we're fabulous, but by having this, you know, internal sponsors that are going across organizations.
And have you discovered in that process, now that you've been with customers for a while now, that there's some value propositions there that you just were surprised at, that you thought, heck, I didn't think you could, that would be interesting for you?
Yeah, so one of the things that we didn't really realise at the beginning, we thought of transformers being old and all that sort of stuff, and you're trying to get more life out of them. But one of the other things that happened, I was at a IEEE conference over in New Orleans, and there was a guy there that was saying, because there's new tech and things happen, engineers aren't going into utilities and staying there forever. And so we have customers who, you know, have been looking after the same transformers for the last 40 years. They're like their children. When something happens, they go, oh yes, that's just that one down the road. That'll be so-and-so just turning on whatever, and they'll know what's going on and know whether they have to worry or not. And so there was a lot of embedded, long history of experience, because it's a complicated chemical environment in these transformers. And at this conference, there was a guy who was running the utility in Chicago, and he said now all of those engineers are going out to these cool tech jobs, not going into utilities anymore. The average tenure of their engineers looking after those assets is now 4 years, and the whole room went, you know. So there's a huge number of that expertise leaving the industry. And so you've got all of these young engineers who are now not specialists, but they're all generalists. So they don't have the deep expertise. And so what that caused us to do then is to both market and pivot our product to be, we're going to embed the expert engineer in the product. So we're not just measuring and doing that sort of thing. we're bringing in all the standards. We consult with some of these expert engineers to say, in this situation, what would you do? And so our IP is now being built up by having these expert insights on that. And so that was sort of the second stage of the product. And we sort of didn't realize there was an HR problem until we were out there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And quite often I was speaking about this with a group this morning, in fact, that we always start off with solving a functional problem. And then those that get successful are ones who can pivot towards a social or emotional problem, you know, where there's fear involved, or whether there's worry or hope, you know, or a dream involved. And I think it sounds like, while, you know, everyone, like every car company, competes functionally on the same level, you know, they all go do exactly the same thing. But some car companies do well because either it's a lot cheaper, as you get a new car for, you know, almost nothing, and some function, you know, with a car that's just ridiculously expensive, it does the same thing. And so I think in some senses what you've understood there is you've unpacked some elements of fear or of concern that people would have, and thinking, how do we actually solve that problem? And so that becomes a new value proposition, really, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So, you know, it's really a combination of training and comfort and all of that. And then you build up that. And of course, from a company value point of view, that once you start to put all of that together, you know, that's a lot harder to copy, and that actually becomes valuable from an acquisition point of view.
I mean, I know that you know Rand very well from the iLab or UQ Ventures Entrepreneur Residence, and they're doing virtual business cards. And what he said is that they had this great idea for a platform that could replace a business card, but the real problem was the behavior. How do you change the behavior of people to actually use this new thing? And so they discovered some ways to help change behavior. And while there's lots of people that have their same product, it's actually that behavioral change program that companies are really interested in. And ultimately that's much more valuable than just because the functional thing can be copied really easily. The human behavior interaction, that's actually much harder to copy.
Yep, agreed.
So that's great. So tell me a little bit about this process of raising capital, because you had this great idea, you had some assumptions, you had some data, you've done some analysis, you'd cobbled together an MVP, you'd run a couple of trials, but then you had to go and, I mean, engineering stuff is expensive, you know, you had to raise a whole lot of money to get some money before you could actually earn some money. So how hard was that? And what was the bar that you had to hit to be able to prove to people that this was a thing, even though you were convinced at that point?
Yeah, it's hard. And, you know, big shout out here to both the Advanced Queensland and the Ignite grant, of which we've had 2. And it really, that first one allowed us to get the prototypes. And so because you didn't need matching funds, that gave us $100 grand that we actually built prototypes and were able to trial out in the customers. So that was the thing that got us off the ground first. So we've all raised money in the past for various enterprises. And so we knew sort of what they were looking for. So in the first instance, okay, if you're trying to look for a seed investor, and a seed investor is just someone who's willing to take a bet on you, you know, and seed investors invest in people more than technologies, because, you know, the chances you're going to be successful are really small, but they go and say, yeah, you know, these folk, they seem to have their head screwed on, they seem to know how to do this thing, I'll have a punt. And it really is at that seed investor stage. So what we did then is we had our initial trials out there. We had 1 order, no, maybe 2 orders for trials, so effectively paid trials from utilities. And then we raised 350, I think, grand from a angel investor, and then we matched up that with some revenue and a $420,000 accelerating commercialization grant. So, you know, effectively, with us putting a bit of money in, working for free, we only had to raise 350, but we had 840 that would take us to that next level. you know, what that then allowed us to do is we're saying, right, to get to our next level, we've got to show traction in Australia. We've got to show this is a thing. We've got to show there's an international market, and that the international people have started to buy. So, you know, when we go towards the next raise, it's always a, what do they need to see? So again, it's their worldview. I'm in the worldview of an investor. I need to see it's a big enough market, you know, that they've got a unique product, you know, all of those sort of standard things like that, that these people can execute more than any. And so that you've got a decent execution plan. So by the end of that next year, we had trials or paid units in 2/3 of the Australian distribution utilities. So that sort of number said, well, must be a problem because most of the market think it's a thing, right? And then we'd also had an initial trial site over in the US and one in Austria, plus, you know, some interest. So that was then enough to say, right, okay, we think this is a thing to go and raise our next round. And so we raised that in August last year. I think it closed, and that was $2 million. And so that has enabled us now to start to scale and go global. So we know that companies die because they don't have enough sales. Full stop. Yep. You know, you can do all the things you want in the world, but if you don't have any sales, it's just going to keep going down. So, you know, that is the proof point. And so it's all about, for us, doing that. So we hired our VP in the Americas, that's Alonso over in Atlanta. And so he is starting to do that market. We now talked to global OEMs, so, you know, the big industrials, Fortune 500 companies, to take our product, because we don't want to build a big sales organization. We want to actually have a technology, have it embedded out there, you know, and in the end have it acquired.
Yeah, that's great. And before I go on, for those of you that are watching, there is an opportunity for you to ask some questions. So there's a Q&A section down the bottom. So if you're interested in asking Terry a question, please drop that into the Q&A and one of us will have a look at that. So please avail yourself of that. So I think that's really interesting, that process of going through on that journey. And I know, and I talk about in these discussions all the time about product market fit. And, you know, the best way to get evidence of product market fit is sales, as you said. You know, if you're struggling to keep up with demand, then you've got product market fit. If you've been selling and selling and selling for year after year after year and you're just not getting traction, and quite often people will say, my customers just don't understand the problem. And ultimately, you know, that makes me feel very sad for them, because it doesn't actually matter what the reason is. If they don't understand the problem, it's probably not because you're not selling it. It's probably because the problem isn't real enough for them. And so clearly it's that ability to be able to tap into a problem. But what I want to talk to you a little bit is a little bit about, you talked about the business model. You know, you don't want to be spending huge amounts of money, you know, building up global infrastructure. And in some ways, in my studies of entrepreneurship and startups, and you've been involved in lots of them as well, Terry, it's often the business model that actually causes things to fail, because, you know, you've had this business model and it involves, you know, doing everything. And that just requires an enormous amount of money. We've got, you know, the hydrogen storage industry, and you're an engineer, so you're familiar with this, you know, has been promising a lot for a long time. A lot of startups, even from UQ, have failed because they needed $40 million to build a prototype. And so I think what's interesting is companies are getting smarter about realizing, look, I don't have to do everything. I just have to do a part of it, and I have to do that really well and partner with other people. So it sounds like that's the sort of a strategy that you've been employing.
Yeah, so our first product, right up until sort of the end of last year, was all somebody else's sensor, our data logger, comms, cloud algorithms, and front end. So, but it's only when we got the money then to do the next thing that we said, actually, we want to create a new sensor that does something else. So we've done that now. We've got patents around that. And so you sort of building that IP, you know, like a Russian doll. So you've got all of those things, you know, that connect in together. So you end up with the hardware. Then really our smarts at the beginning was always going to be our algorithms and, that complex scientific thing. But to sell it, you've got to have the hardware and you've got to have the beautiful front end and all of those sorts of things. So you continually iterate all of that. And now we actually just signed another deal last night with an industrial in Europe, that they see that is, for us it's, and again, putting yourself as to what do they care about, they have a product that is expensive, and what they see is we sell ourselves as a take our product on because we can be an early warning system and a lead in for your product. So, your value proposition to your customers and your value proposition to your partners are completely different things. And so our business model and the way we look at customers and the way we look at partners are quite different. And on the business model thing, it's probably worth talking about, we're a SaaS product, a software as a service. And we originally did that because, to get great valuations, you've got to be a software as a service product, and you've got to have that, that life insurance thing that keeps going forever. And however, even though investors love that, what utilities do is, because capital costs can go onto their rate card, as you were talking about, Cameron, that they then charge it back to us, the users. So every single one of our customers have said, oh, can we pay for 4 years up front? And we say, okay. So, and so what that means for a startup is that, yes, you've got a prepaid liability from a revenue recognition point of view, but you've got cash. Yeah. And so for a startup, that's fantastic. So while we might have a SaaS model, actually in reality is people are paying for upfront. And we, just had Energy Queensland asking us last week saying, I said, oh, well, your subscription runs out in 2021 or something, early 2022. And they said, oh, well, maybe next year we'll look at it, but we'd like a 10-year upfront this time. And you just think, so, okay. Yeah, because that's the way they think about the world. They want surety, and they want to know that you've got that for that period of time. And so even though we see ourselves as a SaaS business, they're used to buying, I'm buying a piece of kit and I'm capitalizing it and doing all of that. That will gradually change over time, and these more conservative industries will start moving into software as a service, but sort of we're positioning ourselves sort of somewhere in between. And so we had to go and do that. From the beginning, we thought it's just, oh, it's $100 a month, it's really nothing. And they think, it is as much effort for me to write a check, to get you a payment for $10,000 as it is for $100. And you want me to do it every month? No. So again, it's thinking about how they see the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Terry. And I love that insight into, because we know that business models these days have to be multi-sided. I mean, the idea of just selling one thing to one customer and getting a one-hit revenue, the cost of customer acquisition is just too high, particularly in these infrastructure where there's not an infinite number of customers. So, there's a finite number of customers. And so in some ways, I think what I really love about the time I've spent in the business school is thinking about business model innovation and how do you actually create business models that make it easy for the customer to engage. And every class I do within the first or second lecture, I write this big word up on the thing about recurring revenues and the ability to have an ongoing relationship with the customer, not just a one-off, because that one-off relationship with the customer is really hard, which is why, vehicle companies make more money out of servicing and parts than they make out of selling cars.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting point. I think I've just got a question here from I think it's Peter.
Yeah, I can answer that. I've read it.
Oh, great. You have a go at it.
Listening to there. And so, yeah, the question on ABB, and we're having conversations with ABB.
Just repeat the question, Terry. So.
Oh, sorry. I know the big electric firms are playing in the transformer space. For example, ABB are pushing their Asset Health Centre product. However, adoption of this product requires the customer to throw away their existing asset management infrastructure. It's going to happen, so the product is going to go nowhere. Do you see any sign that these companies are changing their product model to supply more point solutions than to be more saleable? So I'm trying to think of one example. GE and Schneider are both very much playing in this space. So they're trying to they realize that they need to provide a platform that all of these others can plug into. So it's a bit like that co-opetition model. And so if you think of, the App Store model, I guess, and so Apple creating the App Store and allowing other people to create all of these things and realizing that they are not the font of all technology, while taking a piece of it and keeping control of the customer. So that is exactly where Schneider and GE and a number of these big people are happening, and ABB also, that they're creating these platforms that allow it to be easier to have all of these innovative solutions pitch in underneath and glue in to their platforms. So yeah, absolutely. They're looking at seeing the need to change their business models, because once upon a time, throw out your old big business support systems, buy us and we'll do everything. It just doesn't fly anymore.
Yeah, and that's great. I'm just going to do a little advertisement from our sponsor, which is University of Queensland. So for those of you that are watching, a good friend of both Terry's and mine, Paul Cernier, is going to be talking to us next week. He's one of the founders of Tritium, which is an amazingly exciting technology that's actually powering, pun intended, the vehicle charging industry. So about how do we charge vehicles fast, and they've got some great technology. So that's going to be a great conversation with Paul next week. And just for those of you, what we've found, what has been interesting, is that there's been this huge increase in people interested in professional development. I think people staying at home and realizing actually my job is not terribly secure, or my job doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people are inquiring about doing MBA. We've had more inquiries into the MBA program than ever before. And so if you're interested, any of you that are watching, in some of the, we run a whole series of professional development courses. We've got a couple of online courses, one of which is this Leadership and Innovation course, which is only $8 to do online. And then we've got this fairly new program, the Masters of Leadership in Service Innovation, which is really, covers a lot of the stuff that Terry, you've been talking about with software as a service. So there's the website down there. If you're interested in getting some more professional education, or even dedicated courses for your company, happy to chat about that. Just finally, Terry, just want to chat about this whole thing about you're obviously in a very conservative industry, a female engineer in a very, I'm assuming, maybe I'm incorrectly assuming, that's a very male-dominated industry. But tell me about some of the challenges or the perceptions that you face as a female entrepreneur in a very male-dominated industry.
Yeah, so up until just recently, I had no male customers at all, like not one. Like so it's not as though there are few; it's like there are none. And so it is interesting. And you go into these meetings, and it's, for me, to a certain extent, it's not new or unexpected. When I did engineering many years ago, there were 6 of us out of 300. So you had no choice but to dare greatly and lean in and all the other things, because, if you didn't, you just walking into the room was daring greatly. So you sort of were used to that, but you go into a room and the conversation starts, and there'll be a thing, and then you might make a technical comment, and there's this, oh my God, the cat talks. And you see that, okay, right, let's have a conversation now. And so you've got to, have a certain thick skin and get over that. But after that, it is fine. And to a certain extent, that I can remember my first customer meeting, I went and I was talking to this fellow, and he was their expert. And so he had his glasses on the string, and he had a pocket protector, and it was like, it was like a caricature. And I thought, oh my God, what am I getting into? I've got to understand these customers, and I'm so far away from this. So it is, you are noticed and interest, and people say, oh yes, there is this thing. So it is not a problem, because it is a technical thing. And so you are valued for your insights and the way you think. So it is not so much a problem after you get over the, I'm walking in the room.
Yeah. Do you see is there some benefits of that, having that team? Because there's a lot of conversation now about having women in leadership in corporates, and there's some excellent research now and evidence that corporates that have females on the board or female chief executives, that they just perform better. Have you sort of come across, like, not only in your own instant experience?
Diversity in general. Because again, you have all these different customers out there. You want lots of worldviews in the room, right? You want people of other races. You want people who've been brought up in different countries. You want people who think differently. And, part of that, the females are the first part of that, old people, young people, people of different races, all of these things mean you're coming at a problem from completely different points of view. I know in our R&D team, we have quite a diverse range of people from different parts of the world, and to have those conversations with those wildly different viewpoints, because you think this is really obvious, and then someone comes and goes straight across your view and you go, I never thought about it like that. So that whole diversity thing is really important in being able to create these sorts of products. There is a global collegial thing. So I've done training with our channel partners in India and Brazil and in Europe and various places. And it is bizarre that what looks the same. So in the COVID area, I'd have 15 people across India or across Brazil on the screen, and they're all in their home offices. And so you think, wow, there's this global experience out there, except you have to tell the guy in India to mute because the cow's mooing so loud that, you can't hear the conference call. And so the way that they work and the nuances of how their jobs are changed in their particular environments are really important. And so from a customer point of view, and, literally we're having conversations with Russia the other day and a couple of months ago, and you're just fascinated because there's all these people walking, as you'd expect in Russia, through the snow outside. And they're thinking, okay, well, our big problem is winter and we're doing all of these things and we have this problem with things icing up, whereas meanwhile we're having heat waves in Melbourne. So you have to have all of those different points of view to be able to address a global market. So yes, females, but yes, diversity more.
Yeah, that's great. And look, Terry, I mean, it's great to see, you applying the skills you've learned in so many other environments into an area where you've got some skin in the game, and trying to create some value, unlock some value. You're a great example to a lot of us who are trying to go out there and disrupt and change the game. So look, really appreciate your time. I had a couple of comments on there from Kate saying really appreciate the female entrepreneurship angle, because it is something that often gets overlooked. And I think ultimately your point around diversity is just so right, is that, and doing a session this morning with a group around sales, and I said, look, this is all about empathy. Sales is all about empathy. It's about understanding your customer and understanding the humans who you're trying to engage with. It's not as if you're selling to a computer, you're selling to a human. And the best way to sell to a human is to understand them. And I think diversity, of age, of demographic, of gender, of ethnicity, is becoming, I think, ultimately probably the most important asset. And I think that's ultimately what we're recognizing, is that unless you have diversity in a board or in an executive management team, you're just going to be very narrow and you're going to miss things that other people would see.
Absolutely. Groupthink is dangerous.
Yeah. So look, Terry, great chatting. I always enjoy chatting with you. Thanks so much for being honest and for sharing some of your journey. I'm sure the people who are watching are really interested in it, and look forward to catching up again soon. And I will buy you that lunch next time we catch up.
I'll hold you to that.
Thanks, Terry. Really appreciate it.